Samir, welcome to the World XP podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Eric, for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you were on my radar. Thank you. Shout out to Ben, who works with a publisher. He sent me a few people now, and all of them have been very enlightening conversations. So, when your name came across my desk with the book, The Science of Free Will, How Determinism Affects Everything from the Future of AI to Traffic to God to Bees, I was like, oh, this is going to be a good one. So I was excited. Do you want to do a quick intro for yourself? Tell the people kind of who you are and what you do, and then we'll jump into the question from the last guest, and then I'm sure we'll have plenty of rabbit holes and material to go down with the book. The parts I read were super interesting. So people, if you are looking for something to get lost in, you should go do it. But anyways, yeah, why don't you do a quick intro, and then we can hop into the rest of it.
Oh, yeah, I love rabbit holes. I'm a physicist by training. I got my PhD in 1993 in particle physics at the University of Texas. And back then, we were building this giant thing called the superconducting supercollider, which would have been much bigger than what we have at the LHC at CERN in Geneva. Unfortunately, as I always say, Congress critters are infinitely wise, and they decided to kill the funding for the project. It seems that the funding was killed because it didn't have enough pork for Congress to spread around. Anyway, so once the project was killed, I figured I'd better find something else to do. So I started my futures trading company, and I've been a trader ever since. I now run a small boutique hedge fund. And in my spare time, I still like to do physics and keep up with science. And at the same time, various other things, which included writing this book, which I really enjoyed. And it made me think a lot about technology, the future of technology, artificial intelligence, and what artificial intelligence means for what's going to be happening in the next 5, 10, 15, 50 years.
Yeah, I think. Yes, I'm very excited. Well, this will be so I think the question actually will kind of lead us down maybe the first path, and you can pick any one of, well, the question is, what's a commonly held belief in your area of expertise that you strongly disagree with and why?
Oh, that for me, oh gosh, that's the rabbit hole of all rabbit holes. What
Yeah, I
an
was
excellent question. For me, the thing that is a commonly held belief in my field that I think is completely wrong is that physicists seem to think that there's something terribly mysterious about quantum mechanics. And in my personal opinion, I don't think that is true. I don't think there's anything mysterious about it at all. I think what makes it mysterious is the insistence that we try to look upon it in a classical manner. And what do I mean by that? I mean that we insist that everything should be thought of as a particle. And then we get into this problem of, well, is it a wave? Is it a particle? And the particle is interfering with itself, and look, it's entangled and all this other stuff. But if you just simply, and most physicists would agree with this statement, by the way, but I don't know why they don't apply to this as well. If you simply look upon the particle not as a particle, but very technically speaking, as the excited state of a quantum field, and I'll tell you what that means in a second, then there's no mystery. And this is completely standard quantum field theory, which of course underlies all of nature. And so what is a field? A field is simply a statement that says that at every point in space-time, if this is your space-time, at every point in space-time, you associate a set of numbers with that point. And it's a giant collection of numbers. And that number at each space-time point represents the state of the field at that point in space-time.
What do you mean by state of the field?
The state of the field is what exactly is the difference between the field at this point and the field at this point. And it's the set of numbers that represent that field that mean that, this set of numbers here is different than this set of numbers here, which is different than this set of numbers here. And then when you write down a quantum field theory, all you're basically saying is you're writing down the mathematical relationships between the numbers at this point, the numbers at this point, and the numbers at that point. And the key issue is that a field is defined over all of space and all of time at all times. And all a particle is that, if the field has what's called a vacuum state, So let's say it's like that. Think of a vacuum state where there are no quote particles in it. If you now excite it, the first level of excitement means that it has one particle in it. We interpret that as meaning it's one particle in it. But it's actually just that the field is no longer at this state, it's at a different state at a higher energy level. And if you look at it with that perspective and the fact that the field is spread over all space and time, then the fact that you have entanglement, that just means that there's a field that spreads over all space and time, and something that happened to the field at this point affects what happened to the field at that point. And we know that that must be true. So it's not terribly mysterious. It's not terribly mysterious that a particle also behaves like a wave at certain times, because what you're doing then is you're collapsing what a field is, a collection of numbers, into a concept that you can hold in your head, which is this configuration of the field I'm going to think of as a particle. But it's the field configuration that's relevant, not the fact that it is a particle. Because a particle is a statement about a field configuration. And that's why I don't think it's terribly mysterious. But everybody loves to think of it as mysterious because they like to think of particles as billiard balls. And physicists know particles aren't billiard balls, but the instant you give something the name particle, even to a physicist, the picture that comes in your head is that of a billiard ball. But just because you say it's so doesn't mean it is so.
You said a particle is just a statement or
State.
a state of a field at one given time.
Yes, it's a
Okay.
change in the state of the field. It's an excited state. It's a state that's above the vacuum state. It has more energy than its vacuum state.
Does that mean that? So, okay, can you define like particle physics for the people listening, and then also quantum? Because based on what you said, my next question was going to be, does that mean that like particle, how people would think of it, is obsolete from the standpoint of like if it's just a statement of a, or if it's just a state of a field, then quantum field theory would define all of particles.
Yes, you are correct. It does. Quantum field theory does define all of particles. Particle physics is the statement, when you really pull it down to its most fundamental level, and it's a mouthful to say, which is why people don't say it this way. It is the interaction of different fields in different states at different times. And so that you don't say that in English constantly like that, you say this field state is a particle, or this field state is a particle, or this field state is a particle. And so essentially what you're talking about is the interactions of fields with each other. So when we say particle interactions, it's a shorthand for the statement of the field that the particle is an excited state of, is interacting with another field, which is also in an excited state, which we're also calling a particle. But that's just such a massive mouthful that people don't want to keep saying it over and over and over again.
Yeah, I don't want to say it again either. So, okay, so I'm tracking. That makes sense to me. Then that's okay. So the pieces of your book that I read, do you want to give? I don't really know where to go with this because I'm very curious about all the physics stuff, but also want to talk about the book as well. But obviously they're intertwined. So the free will piece is super interesting to me because um, in the book you mentioned determinism, that that it is predictable for one field state or particle. Like you can, given enough of them, you can predict the behavior of that particle or field state. But then when you go into the collection of field states that make up a person or other being, it becomes almost impossible to like actually get that collection of like it should be possible, which is where you get into free will in theory versus free will in practice. It should be possible in theory, but in practice, the collection of numbers that would be required to predict yours or mine, and I forgot what it was like one was it 300,000 kilometers or whatever of I forgot what the number
Yes.
was, but it
So
was
no,
some yeah, go ahead.
good question. All right. So here's the deal. You and I are made up of roughly, if I remember correctly, 10 to the 27 particles. So that's one followed by 27 zeros. Excuse me, atoms. Excuse me. Each of those atoms is made up of effectively a countless number of particles. And I won't get into why it's countless, but effectively it's a countless number of particles. Nevertheless, every one of those particles is following what is called the standard model of particle physics, which hundreds of physicists, thousands of physicists actually, have spent 100 years building. And it's the most well-tested scientific theory known to mankind. Now, if it is the case that all of those particles are following a mathematical law that we can write down, then in what sense are we different than a machine or than a rock or than any or the weather system or any of those things? And what I say is that the reason that we are different is that the outcome of what we do is not predictable. And the reason the outcome of what we do is not predictable, there are actually three reasons for this. So the first and most straightforward reason is the one you just brought up. Let's say that I wanted to predict my behavior. Let's say your behavior, easier. Let's say I wanted to predict your behavior for the next 1 second. That means that I would need to know not just your state, that is the state of every particle in you over the next 1 second, but I would also need to know any particle that could impinge upon you in that 1 second. And in 1 second, since the speed limit, the universal speed limit is the speed of light, that's 300,000 kilometers around you. So that means I actually need to know the behavior of every single particle, that makes up Earth and near space, almost all the way to the moon, before I can try to make a prediction about your behavior. So from a practical point of view, that's really genuinely never really going to be possible. But you could argue back to me, look, that's an engineering challenge. Fair enough. Philosophically speaking, it is an engineering challenge. So then I'll come back to you with point number two, which is that, look, in every physical theory, the inputs to the theory are real numbers. They're not integers. And whenever you talk about real numbers, you're always talking about an approximation because there's only so many decimals you can go out with the real number when you write it down. You can't write an infinite number of real numbers by definition. But if the system you're talking about is sensitive to, let's say the numbers out at the 75th decimal place, then again, you're stuck. You can't predict again. So that's the limit that comes from chaos theory. But you could come back to me and say, listen, that too is an engineering problem. I can build a better machine that can tell me to the 79th digit if I need 75. To which I say, yes, you're right. Fair enough. That's true. So those are two engineering challenges. But there is a third challenge, and this is where Stephen Wolfram comes up in my book. He identified what he called the principle of computational irreducibility. And that's a mouthful, but it's actually a very simple concept. And the concept is that there are systems in which you can write down the rules of the system. The rules can be incredibly simple. I like to say they can be so simple that a 5-year-old could follow them. But the output of the system cannot, I repeat, cannot, under any circumstance whatsoever, ever be predicted. All you can do is follow the rules and see what the outcome is. You cannot ever, in any way, shortcut the result. And so my statement is that's not an engineering challenge. That is a fundamental limit on your knowledge. And that's a fundamental limit of your knowledge coming from both mathematics and from science. And that is actually what guarantees that there is no possible way in this universe that you can not have free will in practice. And your free will in practice is a statement that even if the underlying system is entirely deterministic, that is to say it's following mathematical laws, that doesn't mean that you know what the output is going to be. Or to put it more poetically, you cannot know what your life will be like unless you've lived it.
Yeah, I thought that was when I got to that point and you were talking about a piece of computer code that even if you know what it's supposed to do, you still have to let it run to get to the end. Um, and I thought that was super. One, it is easy to understand for somebody that doesn't dive into the world of quantum and physics and stuff to the nature that you do. But also, did you run into kind of spiritual questions, or I will say either one, spiritual or like brain, like neuroscience questions as you're running through this?
Yes.
So can you, some of if it's later in the book, forgive me, I did not get to read all of it. But one of the things that's super interesting to me is if you've got all these particles that you can like predict each one, but that's just a physical state of being. Like if I react differently to some stimuli, like how um did you run into that from like a neuroscience, like different people's brains interpret different stimuli in different ways?
Yes, that's a very good point. And what I tried to make clear in the book is that you have to ask yourself, what, for example, is the difference between you and me, or the difference between me and my dog, say, or between my dog and a rock? Because you, me, the dog, and the rock are all made of the exact same things as the rest of the universe. In the first, approximation, we're all made of atoms. Those atoms are identical across the universe, and I show that in the book.
Hmm.
But it's more than that. Those atoms also made up of the same fundamental particles that again go back to the standard model of particle physics, and we already know the equation that explains them. So the only difference between you and me, or me and a rock, or you and my dog, or whatever it is the arrangement of the atoms themselves. That's it. There is no other difference between any and all of us. And so, any neuroscientific basis, or, where you say, look, X's brain works a little bit differently than Y's, or whatever it is. And I talk about some of this, and I make analogies with Mac OS, and I explain how you can think of computer science and so on. But the point still remains that the actual difference between any two objects in the universe is the arrangement of their atoms and nothing
And
else.
yeah. So then you got into the concept of death, and basically the death is just the unarranging or rearranging of
Yes,
those atoms.
precisely.
So from a physics perspective, death all of a sudden becomes very explainable,
Yes.
but to like just a person living their life, it's still very unexplainable. There's a different like so you could go into this disease is attacking my cells, and so the atoms are therefore rearranging because the cells are dying, et cetera, et cetera. And you can get into like the weeds on that. But how does that have any impacts on I think in the book you mentioned that there were some scientists that had brought a pig back to life or something like that.
Yeah, but
So like
temporarily.
yeah, so what's the like impacts to that on because then it feels almost like we're getting into the realm of not necessarily like playing God, but it gets into like this creepy world where it's like there's forces that if you ask anybody 50 or 100 years ago, they're like we should not be messing with these things. Like it's from God or whoever or whatever entity that they believe in. And now we're kind of wading into that kind of world. What like when you're writing and you're getting into this sort of kind of you're touching the spiritual a little bit. How is that for you? Like like I don't know what your beliefs are from that perspective, but like did was there stuff in your own life that you had to reconsider as you're writing this or like walk me through that sort of
Yes,
piece?
that's a very good question. So the thing is, I'm very hard-headed in the sense of there are physicists that are not quite as hard-headed as me. I'm hard-headed in the sense that if the equations of physics say X, then I will simply take that as until disproved. That's the nature of reality, and I take it
Hmm.
that way. So from a hard-headed physics point of view, um, one of the things that I went through in the book, and I explained this, is that in fact, it is really true that fate exists. In fact, it really must exist because everything is deterministic.
Hmm.
And if fate exists, then you really need to think about very carefully what that means for you and your life. And so, there are sort of various things that have happened to me, as I'm sure have happened to you over the years, that you resent and you say, this is not fair and it shouldn't have been that way or whatever. And I'm sure it's not fair and it shouldn't have been that way. But the fact that fate exists means you might as well accept it and move on. Um, and that's sort of what you learn as a trader as well. A trade goes against you. You thought the trade was perfect. You just have to say, you know what? I lost money. That's life. Move on. And there's just nothing else you can do. And that actually, as I was writing it, I said, yeah, okay, this is actually something worth learning. and something worth sort of keeping in the back of your head and saying, yeah, you got to be like that. And I think a lot of very successful people have that attitude, which is to say, them's the facts. I'm going to accept them, and then that's it. Move on. So yeah, I mean, that was really the main sort of takeaway that I had from really contemplating this issue.
You hear lots of people say things like control the controllables or things like that, and it's very interesting the intersection between fate and free will, where it's like, yeah, you have free will in practice, but also fate exists. And so where from the perspective I can see if somebody were to learn that and they were to be like, well, fate exists anyways, then like what's the point? I might as well just kind of like it can get very um I don't know if depressing is the right word, but to have this laid out for you from a scientific perspective, I was reading some of it and I was kind of like, okay, well, if I have to have free will, because like probabilistically speaking, it is impossible to predict how all of the particles will interact and whatever the case may be is like the numbers is like impossible based on what the points that you laid out. Then okay, sounds good. So then I really have control over my life, and if I really have control over my life and I'm still here, like that's not good because then it really lays the responsibility of each individual at their own feet. And that's something that might be as difficult to grapple with. And then you can go back, well, fate exists, so I guess it's fine. And it's like that it mixes the two. But I think for me anyways, the takeaway as far as being responsible for my own actions is like is up makes me hopeful in a way, I'd say. Because it's like, okay, no, it really is me, and then you can then make the changes, which I think is important. And I don't really know as a society how we kind of get to a better point with that, because there's so many things that feel like are out of your control from the standpoint of like, okay, the government's doing this, there's wars here, inflation this, I'm never going to be able to buy a house here, blah, blah, blah. And then you lay out, well, actually, your life is your own like decisions, which is true. But then there's also things that are floating around you that make things difficult. Like people my age, like I'm never going to be able to buy a house. It's like, yes, that seems to be the case. But also you have the power to do something about it. And that can be difficult because you have to look yourself in the mirror and be like, okay, I can fix this. But there's both, there's give and take. How when you're writing through this and running through all these kind of these situations, I'll call them like issues or for lack of a better word, but these kind of um, issues. How, in your own head, because you've been very successful, you're writing books, you're trading, you have PhDs and all these sorts of things. If somebody was to look at you and be like, well, yeah, it's easy for Samir to say that he has free will because he just chose to do all these things, and then he just proved that free will exists in practice with science, and I'm sitting here in my parents' basement like playing video games. Like how do you reconcile those two kind of things? Because there is a society out there that makes things like that. It seems like things are out of your control.
Yes, that's very true. Um, I have again, this came from writing the book. I have a uh, related viewpoint to that. And the related viewpoint is that if fate exists, then regret is useless.
Mm.
And if regret is useless, then you should actually do what Jeff Bezos said, and I quoted him in the book. And he says that he always thinks about, I'll get this wrong, but roughly speaking, he always thinks about how he's going to feel about some decision he made today way in the future. And then if he thinks that he's going to feel bad about that decision, then he doesn't make the decision. So one of the things I know is that he founded Amazon when he had an incredibly good job on Wall Street, and he was a senior guy at, I think, D.E. Shaw, which is a famous hedge fund. And he nevertheless left the job, and D.E. Shaw, the head of the firm, tried to talk him out of it, saying, you've got a great career here, you know, why you should be staying and so on. And then somebody asked him afterwards, why would you leave a very successful job to do this incredibly crazy thing doing the startup. And he said, because I'd always regret it in the future if I hadn't tried. So what that tells me is that the honorable thing to do in life is to always try, but there is no particular purpose in worrying about the result, because honestly, that's out of your hands. But so the honor is in the trying. The succeeding is what happens because that's the universe. It decided to either it decides whether you succeed or you don't succeed.
Did you have things that were confirmed, like in your own belief system? So, for example, if you believed exactly what you just said, that the honor is in the trying rather than the result, if you believed that prior, like, did you have things that, as you're going through the math and the research and kind of the step by step of why free will exists, um, did you have things that were both confirmed and then also things that you had to switch within, like, oh, I believe this, but the math is not working itself out that way?
Yeah. So I had always kind of believed that sort of the honor is in the trying, but that was more the sort of thing you say to make yourself feel better, as opposed to it being reality. But in fact, it is reality. There's just I just don't see how you can argue against it. That is in fact true.
Mm.
So that's the first point. And then the sort of the second point is that it had never occurred to me, despite the fact that once somebody points it out to you, it's obvious, that the only difference between me and a rock is the arrangement of my atoms. And so therefore, what is the difference between me, for example, and the weather? Right? So if people say, sort of colloquially, the weather has a mind of its own, that's no longer a colloquial aphorism, whatever you want to call it. That's actually true. The weather really does have a mind of its own because, in fact, it's computationally irreducible and cannot be predicted, except in, to some limited extent for a short period of time, and even then, not very well. So the weather, in fact, has free will. And so, in fact, when you go down this chain of reasoning, you realize that there's a lot of things that have practical free will that you wouldn't necessarily have even thought about in the past. So I give the example, for example, of a cockroach. And the reason this is relevant is not for shock value, but because there's a scientist who decided, Greg Gage, I think his name is, and he decided to fit a cockroach with an electronic device that sent signals to its, what are they called, feelers, the things out in the front,
Antennas.
antennas. And basically, for a while, he could direct the cockroach around by sending signals to its feelers. So it was a cyber roach. But eventually, the cockroach learned in 15 minutes, actually, to ignore that stimulus and went back to doing what it wanted to do before it was given the stimulus, which I thought was fascinating.
Oh, that's wild. Because you see that sometimes with like MRIs or psychological kind of, they want to make sure that the like this limb exists so that like they'll shock you or whatever, and like does your hand open and close, and like, okay, this part of the brain is firing when I flex this thing or whatever. Um but you can learn to ignore that. Would did you dive deeper into the cockroach thing from the standpoint of like in humans how difficult it would be to ignore certain stimuli? Like I see this with like addictive personalities, for instance. Somebody is addicted to alcohol or whatever, and they're good for a week or two, but as soon as it's around them, they like can't help themselves. Like, did you run into that sort of um scenario?
That's a fantastic question. The answer is yes, but with a slightly, excuse me, different viewpoint.
Okay.
So the question I asked is, again, I'm a physicist, right? Once you're a physicist, everything is physics. So I asked the question of what deterministic system is closest to, you know, to, for example, thinking about brains in such a way that you can say something sensible about the way brains behave. And so the analogy I came up with, which I think is a very good one, is that of operating systems. And I took the example of Mac OS. And so the point is that you can think about brains in two different ways. You can think about brains having hardware. So that's the neurons and the synapses and the chemical elements that passes between them and the electrical signals and so on and so forth. But you can also think of them as collected pieces of self-organized modules. So there's a module for seeing, there's a module for hearing, there's a module for pontificating, which is what I'm doing right now, and so on. And the question is whether, for example, an addiction is an issue with the software, that is to say, the programming of some module, or it's with the hardware, that is to say that some collection of neurons is severely miswired or something along those lines. And so I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not sure that anybody does. But the statement is pretty clearly that it's easier to fix software than it is to fix hardware. And so if that's the case, if we can find that addiction is, say, a bug in the programming, we can think of being able to fix that much more easily than if the problem is a bug in the microcode, if you wish, or in the hardware of the system or whatever. And so, thinking of it that way, you can sort of separate whether this is an easy to fix problem or a hard to fix problem. So that's the perspective I was thinking about it in.
Yeah, that makes total sense. You see people, some of the podcasts I listen to have like veterans on them, and they talk about how they go do like ayahuasca or one of these, or ibogaine or one of these things, and they were alcoholics before and their marriages were falling apart, and they do this kind of psychedelic, and it like rewire, like they don't even want to drink. It like something clicks in the brain. And that's kind of where I was a little bit going with that, and you answered part of it. But in terms of like, you have what's the chemical? Oxy, no, I don't remember. Serotonin, or like all these other things that when you do a specific action, it's released in the brain and it makes you feel a certain way. How, because if you've got one, and I know you said you didn't know the answer, but I'm just curious to see if there's other pieces that kind of ran into this. But like, if you have that sort of like problem, w- and you talk about easy to fix or hard to fix problem, and you run into this kind of like psychedelic type situation, um, like has there been? I'm just kind of, I guess I'll use pontificating as well. Research in like what actually gets like, do we have the ability to actually switch, like see what like scan the brain and see like, okay, now this action is releasing. Oh, this is gonna bug me that I don't know what the chemical is. Anyways, but keep going. I'm gonna look it up.
Some of it is already happening.
Okay.
It's the fMRI, functional MRI, is a way of looking to see which parts of the brain light up when different actions are occurring. So that's one thing. The other one is sort of Elon Musk's Neuralink idea, which is
Yes.
to say by putting stuff through the scalp, you'll be able to link it to computers, and then you'll be able to know some more things and so on and so forth. Um, and then also there's some reasonably good theories. They're not proven, but some reasonably good hypotheses. I shouldn't call them theories. I'm a physicist. Reasonably good hypotheses for why things like ayahuasca and other such things seem to work for PTSD and so on. And the reason is that they seem to make the brain more plastic for a short period of time or a medium period of time. And during that time, you can rewire the connections in the brain and hopefully get rid of some of the things that are bothering the person by actually rewiring the brain. And in fact, what's happening there is, going back to physics again, you are in fact changing the physical structure of the brain. You're changing its arrangement of atoms, as a matter of fact.
Would that would then be the road to fixing something like MS or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or one of these type things? Is that an accurate statement that that is kind of how you would do that? Like if you could figure out how to do it accurately?
Yes, if it's all um, something that is an issue that is essentially located only in the brain, then I think the answer is yes, probably something like this could be used to do it. If there's more to it than just the brain, then it'll be a more complicated solution.
Mm,
The nice thing is the physics tells you, by the way, that essentially all of these things are, in the long run, who knows how long it'll take, but in the long run, fixable. There are no laws of physics that say you cannot fix this. Like there's a law of physics that says you can't go faster than the speed of light.
Yeah.
There's no such law that says you can't fix Parkinson's or you can't fix, MS or whatever it is. You can. We just have to figure out how to do it.
Mm.
And it may be, by the way, a combination of both software and hardware. Not clear.
So I'm going to put you on the spot then. If the
Yep.
brain is hardwired wrong or whatever is wrong in the brain, is that an argument against free will in practice? Because something is wrong from the standpoint of like, we don't know how to fix it or it's not wired properly, and this stimuli will always produce this behavior.
Yes. So, in fact, yeah, you bring up a very good question. And one of my friends that read the book originally brought up the same question
Mm,
because he said that, one of his relatives or something has Tourette's, I think. And, what does that mean? And the real answer, and again, I'm a physicist, I'm a hard-headed guy from physics. So the physics more or less tells you that there are, in fact, different quantities, if you wish, of free will. Um, and so there will be people that have more free will than others. And that will
mm,
have to do with how predictable they are. So, if in fact you have somebody that has a lot of brain pathologies, and you feel for them, but their behavior is heavily dictated by their brain pathologies, then yeah, they have less free will than other people. That's just a fact.
mm. Interesting. I wonder, a lot of the work with kind of the psychedelic seems to be very promising into helping people with
Yeah, I
those
think it
sorts of
is.
situations. So, fingers crossed that um, the whoever in government that controls whether those things are legal or not can look into
That's
some of that
another question.
research. Yeah, that's a different topic for a different day. You mentioned one thing earlier, and this is more a very just curiosity question. You mentioned that as a physicist, you look at everything through the lens of physics. Does that get boring ever? Like from the standpoint of you can go to a family gathering or you can go to a comedy show and it's like the kind of the surprise or the shock, the punchline of the joke is what elicits a reaction from you or somebody else. Like, do you turn it off ever? Or like I can imagine just reading the book and then looking at life. I was like, I can imagine that this would get like slightly boring and depressing. So, like, are you able to turn it off or like how does that work for you?
That's a great question, actually. It depends very much on what it is.
Mm,
So, if it's a science fiction movie and the physics is insanely off, as it is with some of them, I can't take it. It irritates me too much, and I just simply can't deal with it. If it's not too badly off, then I can more or less suspend disbelief and say, okay, this is a fantasy. So I give an example. There is no sound in space.
mm.
So, much as I like Star Wars, and I do, where's the sound coming from, guys? There's no sound in space. But the stories are so good. I'm like, you know what? Never mind. Um, but then, there'll be other science fiction stuff, which is just where the physics is just so absurd that I can't take it seriously, and I turn it off. Can't deal with it. Um, at family gatherings and so on, that's a good question. Um, our family gatherings tend to be two types of people.
What about like the predictability of people, like in your life? Like for sometimes for me, I will not be motivated to go to a thing because I'll be like, this guy will say, talk about these things, and this person will do this, and this person will do that. And it's like, I know what's going to happen. Why do I have to go?
Yep. So 9 times out of 10, I won't go. If the 10th time out of 10 I have to go before because of some social obligation, then I'll go, and mostly I'll just shut up and I won't say anything. And I'm actually perfectly capable of sitting there very quietly, not being rude, just
Yeah.
not saying anything for 3 hours.
So what's the type of person that piques your interest then, from the standpoint of like, you're gonna go play squash, right? But that's an activity that you like to do. But the
Yes.
partner that you're playing with, there's two sides to it, right? If you're playing with a partner, you should know kind of a predictability of what they're going to do and how they move and stuff. But then by the
Yep.
same person, if you're just sitting across from somebody like we're doing now,
Yep.
the type of person like so in your life, are you very selective with who you spend time with in that way?
There's only two types of people that drive me insane.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'm very happy with almost anybody. The first is that, given that I'm in finance, I meet a lot of finance people that are interested in, guess what? Only finance. To me, that's just boring. So I try mostly not to hang out with people like that. So that's the first set of people that drives me absolutely nuts. And the second set of people that drives me nuts are people that have opinions, but don't have any reason for their opinions. I'm very happy to debate opinions with anybody. I don't care what your political beliefs are. I don't care what your religious beliefs are. I don't care about anything. Just please give me reasons for why you believe what you believe so we can have a discussion, an open discussion. So there are people that are very dogmatic. I try not to talk to those either. Other than that, I'm open with anyone. I'm very happy to have a conversation.
That's fair enough. I don't disagree with either of those. Is there something? Are there more things about the book that I should be asking? I feel like to summarize, it's kind of the things that we talked about, but you go very in depth into each point, and I don't know enough about the physics to know what to ask about each point. But from what you said and from what I read, I understand at my remedial level of math and stuff. Is there stuff that I should be asking that I haven't about the book specifically?
I think the part of it that people, and this is luck on my part, that people will find most interesting because of the success of ChatGPT. And the book was written before ChatGPT, by the way. It just takes 3 years to come into print. Is the future of AI.
Okay,
And
let's get into that. Yeah.
a thought about what AI is in the first place.
Okay, yeah, let's get into that.
So let me tell you some of the things that people say, which are just basically flat out wrong, provably wrong. So the first provably wrong thing that people say is that AI or something artificial, excuse me, let me be even more accurate. Something artificial that is not human or not biological, if you wish, cannot be conscious. And therefore, number two, it cannot have emotions. And therefore, number three, it cannot have free will. All three of those are demonstrably false. And so let's see why. So the first thing to understand is, I'm sure you saw The Empire Strikes Back. So if you look at the end of The Empire Strikes Back, if I remember correctly, Luke Skywalker loses his right hand, doesn't he, when he has a duel with Darth Vader?
Yep.
And then the last scene, or almost the last scene, is that give him an artificial hand.
Yes.
Right? And then the movie ends. So here's the question. If you replace Luke Skywalker's hand with an artificial hand, is it still Luke Skywalker?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now, let's say that I replaced Luke Skywalker's eyes with bionic eyes. Is it still Luke Skywalker?
Yes, it's still like the essence of him.
Good. Now, supposing I decided to change each of his internal organs one by one, from biological ones to artificial ones. Is it still Luke Skywalker?
I would say yes.
Good. Now, let's go into his brain. And remember, this is a thought experiment. And we say that, look, this set of neurons over here, they're made up of standard atoms. So we're going to remove those atoms and we're going to put new atoms. Is it still Luke?
I would say I would see argument for both ways. You would get into somebody comes back from war or whatever and the wife is like, I don't even know you anymore, you're a different person, right? So you get into that. But then on the flip side, that would be it would depend on how you define consciousness and what the essence of that person is.
Precisely. You got it. Exactly. And the essence of the person, that's fantastic. The essence of the person is the arrangement of their atoms. And because the essence of the person is the arrangement of their atoms, there is absolutely no reason to think that a different arrangement of atoms, which you decide to call artificial, is not conscious or doesn't have emotions or whatever it is different in any way than this particular collection of atoms that happens to be you. You cannot say that a priori. There is no law of physics that says that you can actually make that statement. And if you cannot make that statement, then you cannot say that something that is, quote, artificial cannot be either conscious or have emotions or be bored or any of these other things. Now, why is that relevant? That is relevant because AI is made up of the same atoms that we are, in the sense that AI is running on a silicon substrate. We are running on, I guess, a carbon substrate. But the fact still remains that those atoms are all the same atoms that make up the rest of the universe. After all, we take sand to make silicon substrates. Then the sand is all around us and it's a natural ingredient, which we then change. The point is that the difference between us and AI is largely the specific arrangement of the specific atoms that make up the AI versus the specific atoms that make up us. And there's, again, literally no reason to think that the collection of rules that is us can be conscious, but the collection of rules that is AI cannot.
So is AI taking over the world?
Well, probably not. And the reason that it probably isn't is that what AI, at least at the moment, is 100 years from now, I don't know, but in the near future, what AI is very, very likely to do in the near future is it's going to take over those tasks that we can precisely define and which are therefore easy for it to understand and then do something that we like. Our job as humans is going to be to decide what it is that we want rather than more of what it is that we want and less of how it is that we do it. So, for example, a lot of programming today consists of very smart people sitting in front of monitors, writing, in many cases, boilerplate code. They're not really deciding what needs to be done. They're implementing something that's essentially, the company or the researcher or whatever decided to do. Lots of that implementation is going to get automated away. But the actual human aspect of that is deciding what you want to do. AI can't help you with that because AI doesn't know what you want.
That gets back to the free will and practice problem, which is like now you are going to have to take responsibility for what you want and actually think about it and decide. And interesting.
Precisely.
Yeah. Okay. Keep going.
So that's point one. Point two is I wanted to show that this intuition that we all have that AIs can't have emotions can't possibly be true. And the reason it can't possibly be true, and I talk about this in the book, is did you know bees have emotions?
Yes, and plants, I think too, right?
Yes, isn't that but isn't that incredible? Bees have an incredibly small brain, and you can actually induce them to get PTSD. And this researcher in England, I've forgotten his name, he wrote a book on this topic. Actually, and I quote it in my book, it can induce PTSD in bees. So a bee is a very, very, very tiny little computing device, if you like. It's tiny little brain. So in fact, this goes back to another one of Stephen Wolfram's principles, which is that universal computation, which I'll define in a second, is ubiquitous. So a universal computer is simply a computer that is capable, if you feed it the right program, in principle, to compute anything. So in fact, you can create minimal universal computers with next to nothing. And Wolfram goes off and shows this. If you're familiar with Turing machines, he basically shows that you can have a 3-color 2-state Turing machine. That is to say 3 colors and 2 states of the head, which is essentially nothing, which is universal. You can write any computer program and compile it so it runs on that Turing machine. That's essentially the simplest possible computer. What's my point? My point is that if something that simple can be a universal computer, it's in fact, technically speaking, very, very, very technically speaking, no different than us. We're also a universal computer. And so that means that computer can also run the same programs in effect that we can. Of course, it won't be able to because it'll have problems with memory and it's too small and so on. But in principle, it can.
Yeah.
And because in principle it can absolutely have emotions. There's no reason that it couldn't.
That's very interesting. An interesting thing to think about. Like if you give it enough prompts, is it going to be mad at you for repeating the same prompt 27 times in a row?
Yes, and you've seen that with ChatGPT, haven't you? They've actually studied this. And I when I use ChatGPT, I found it to be true. If you say to it, listen, this is really important to me. I really care about this. Please take, care on this. And, thank you very much for helping me and so on. And you're really nice to it. You get better responses. It's already true.
People, take note of that. You'll get better responses if you're nice to the if you're nice to AI.
Yeah,
That's so fascinating. It makes sense though. It does make sense. Like one, I think, well, also you could argue maybe that for a language model, it's gone through all of the stories and all of the things on the internet and all of the text, and it has picked up that it knows you're supposed to be nicer to you if you are nice to it.
sure.
Could you argue that? But I mean,
Yes,
I'm so
you
that's an
could.
interesting thing as well.
But remember, we teach our children that,
Yes.
right? When they behave badly, we say, no, 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 you can't do that. You need to be polite and so on and so forth. It's learned behavior.
Yeah. Huh.
And of course, what's uncouth in one culture is considered extremely couth in the other.
That's true. Yeah,
Like
fair
I
enough.
remember when I visited China in 1988 or something, our host told us, look, if you don't make a mess of the tablecloth, then the restaurant will think you didn't like the food.
Hmm.
Is that true or false? I don't know. That's what our host told us.
Interesting. Huh. All right, people listening, take note of ChatGPT. Be nice to it. Um, all right, last couple of things about the book that I'm just scrolling through the table of contents just quickly. The Why Does Evil Exist
Yes,
piece.
because it
Yeah.
must.
Okay, go on that.
So if fate exists and if everything is deterministic, then by definition, something called evil must exist because the definition of evil is something that we decide is evil. The universe doesn't care. The universe is just following rules.
Hmm.
But we as a society say, look, this kind of behavior is not acceptable. It's evil. But you've got to remember that the definition of evil changes over time. Like, right, not until not very long ago, torture was acceptable.
Yeah.
Before that, what did the Vikings do? They were raiding and pillaging and doing all kinds of other bad things, right? Today we look at it in horror, but nobody back then thought it was terribly bad. So evil exists because we define what evil is. Therefore, it exists because it must. It's our definition.
Well,
And
it's the
and
same. You can't do good things if there's no like evil to contrast
to do
with.
them
Like,
against, yes,
yeah,
that's true too. And then
yeah,
the other problem is that there are many people that we consider today to be evil that at the time when they were doing the evil thought they were doing a good thing. So I talk about that in the book too. So
yeah.
you don't really get an absolute definition of this, which is why people sort of sit down and say, why don't we come up with something like, what was it called? Didn't the UN come up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or something like
Yeah,
70, 80 years ago?
yeah,
But then that's a human definition. I'm not saying it's wrong. I think it's great. But nevertheless, it is a human definition. The universe
yeah,
doesn't care.
yeah. Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit and go into kind of your life and how you ended up writing the book.
Shoot.
From the standpoint of was so you're in physics. Was physics something that you always wanted to do? Was that like the passion from the beginning? Okay, so you're going into school and what's the path like at that time and kind of the lens in which are you familiar with Eric Weinstein?
I know who he is, yes.
Okay,
I'm
so
not very familiar with his work, but I know who he is.
he made a statement on the podcast, I don't know, some in the like recent past, basically saying that the reason that there hasn't been the next like huge technological breakthrough, it's like we still have an iPhone and it's just a better iPhone, but there's not the next one, is because academia seems to be, I don't know, gatekeeping things is kind of the phrase that he was using, or that we're like we spent a lot of time on string theory, which I don't know enough about string theory to say anything about it really, but the way that he described it, I was like, okay, that sure. When you're going through school and at that time, like where like, what is the path for you to get on? Because you mentioned that the funding for the project was killed, and instead of going back into physics or academia, you went a different direction. So, like, the path from undergrad to PhD to like, what is it like at that time for you, and kind of what are well, I don't know. I'll just leave it at that, and then we can fill in the blanks as we go.
So let me riff slightly on your question.
Sure.
Um, I don't disagree with the statement that academia has, to some extent, siloed things too much, and has, to some extent, ossified things too much. But you have to sort of understand the context of that.
Sure.
And the context of that is that we as a society uh, peaked our funding of science in the 1960s as a percentage of GDP, and it has steadily fallen since. And it's actually a small fraction of what it used to be back in the 1960s as a percentage of GDP. We really don't fund breakthrough basic science anymore. We basically fund incremental science and we fund conventional science. And we also try essentially only to fund applied science. So, for example, uh, um, take take 1850 something. I'll get the date roughly right, but basically I'll get it wrong. But 1850 something or the other, uh, we discovered the first inklings of electricity and magnetism. And so at that point, I believe some politician asked one of the first scientists, "Hey, what is this good for?" And the response, I think this was Michael Faraday, I don't remember, was, "So what is it? What good is a newborn baby?" But now, 150 years later, our entire civilization depends upon electricity.
Hmm.
Similarly, Albert Einstein discovered or invented, however you want to think about it, the general theory of relativity in 1916, but which is the theory, by the way, that tells you about the expansion of the universe and black holes and all the rest of the stuff. That same theory is used to set the clocks of GPS satellites, without which those clocks wouldn't work, without which we wouldn't have GPS, without which we wouldn't have our iPhone. How long did that take to be commercialized? 100 years. The problem is that we are not funding that kind of research much anymore. We're not funding seed corn research, as I call it. And the less you fund seed corn research, by definition, the less of it you're going to have. And this is one of the things where both the left and right ought to agree. I don't know if they will, but they ought to agree, because this is one of the few things that only government can do. And the reason only government can do it is that it's not in any private person's interest to fund something that will have applications 50 years from now. But it is in a
Yeah.
government's interest to do so. But they're not doing it. And because they're not doing it, we're not getting enough funding of various sciences. And because we're not getting enough funding of various sciences, you end up with people that are in academia being very risk averse and then ending up squabbling over what little money there is for them to actually get, particularly for basic research. So NSF grants, I was looking at this a couple of years ago. If I remember correctly, the average NSF grant for theoretical physics, for example, I think is like $35,000 or something like that, which is, I mean, it's not even peanuts, it's less than peanuts.
Yeah.
And the chance of getting it is 1 in 5. So you've taken these heavily trained people, some of your most heavily trained people, and you're basically making them fight over scraps. This is just, it's not even stupid. I don't have words for it. That's really the fundamental problem. If you really want to get down to the basic issue of why economic growth has been slowing, why everybody's fighting with each other, why people are not getting rich at the same rate as they were before, is because we haven't invented any new fundamental technologies. And we haven't invented any new fundamental technologies because at the end of the day, we haven't done any basic science.
Yeah. I think that sums it up quite nicely. That makes sense as well. But the other thing that is strange to me, and we don't really have to go down this rabbit hole, but college is so expensive now. So like
Yes,
where's all the money going? I
that's
don't
true.
understand.
So the best current guess, I was reading some research on this. The best current guess is that a lot of it is going into administration and into facilities. So it used to be the case that, I'm going to get these ratios wrong again, but it used to be some fraction of people were uh, administrators and some multiple of that fraction were professors. Now it's become the opposite. That is to say, there are many more administrators now than there are professors, and it used to be that there were many more professors than there were administrators. There's your problem right there.
Well, that sounds lovely. Um, okay. So for you then at that going through undergrad into getting your PhD, what is some of the things that you're learning? What are you doing your research on? And then when you ended up in that kind of flashpoint of the project is getting killed, what was the decision point? You're like, okay, I'm not gonna go back into this field. I'm gonna go do my own. I'm gonna switch industries. What was the path for you? And kind of if you've got, I don't know, stories or anecdotes along the way as well. What are some of those?
Well, so the thing is that even though I wanted to be a physicist, I actually started off as an engineer.
Hmm.
So I started off in electrical engineering. And I mean, I enjoyed the engineering. It's just that I don't really have the engineering mindset. The engineering mindset is let's build a practical product. I really do have the physics mindset, which is let's understand what the principles are behind the practical product, which is not the same thing at all. So I was a deeply unhappy engineer. Let's put it that way. And so I decided that I'd better go back to my first love, and I just need to do physics because there's no point in my trying to do something that doesn't fit my brain. So that's why I switched, and I switched from electrical engineering to particle physics, which, by the way, was madness. I would never recommend doing it again. I knew nothing. I thought I knew something. I knew nothing. So I come into this place. I went to the University of Texas, and I come into this place with all of these very well qualified people with incredible undergraduate physics degrees that know everything compared to me. I don't know anything. Um, and then cheerfully we're told on the first day of orientation, yeah, so 4 out of 5 of you are not going to be here at the end of 2 years. And I said, what? This is why I'm here. I have an 80% chance of failing. Oh no. So at that point, I'm not exaggerating. I worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week for 2 years without break. Just A, trying to catch up, and B, trying to understand the graduate physics classes into which I was dumped headfirst, because that's where you start. And then everything is taken as a prerequisite. They expect you to know it already, and I didn't know anything. So it was just hard. But I got through it somehow. I don't know how, but I did. And then I started working on actual interesting physics problems and ended up publishing papers and so on. And that was great fun. But after they ended up canceling the superconducting super collider, my thought process was, well, I really do like fundamental physics. I'm not really interested particularly in applied physics or experimental physics, so that's not how my brain works. And there's not going to be any new data coming out of anything new in my lifetime. So I think I'd better find something else to do. And by complete random luck, chance, whatever you call it, I've been a big fan of the magazine. Like to call it a weekly newspaper, The Economist. And so I've been reading it now 40 years or something. And in October 1993, if I remember correctly, it had Boris Yeltsin on the cover with tanks and burning things. Anyway, it had a long survey article called The Mathematics of Finance. So I read this article, it's like 24 pages long or something, and it said that there were people that were using chaos theory, which I published in, to make short-term predictions in the financial markets. And I said, oh, cool. I've published in this. Why don't I see if this will work? And I was still at that point holding out some hope for an academic career. So I started playing with chaos theory in the financial markets, and I was actually expecting to disprove it because I'd known of the efficient markets hypothesis. I'd read Eugene Varma, I read all of this other stuff, random walk down Wall Street, all this stuff. I said, this is nonsense, can't be true. But then, in fact, when I started doing the mathematics of it and applied it to the S&P 500, I found, in fact, particularly back then when the market was less efficient, in fact, you could make predictions and make money from it. So then I said, okay, they killed the SSC. This seems to work. Maybe this is what I should be doing. So that's really how I got started.
Was the problem set that you laid out of the funding piece already taking place by the time that the superconductor funding was killed, from the standpoint of like you knew already that the physics departments are wrapped up in string theory and incremental science, so like were you aware of that already, or was that something that you figured out later after you left?
Both.
Okay.
So one of the things is that during the time I was a graduate student, there were some very famous string theorists that were professors at the University of Texas. And a lot of my friends were their graduate students. So I would get the exciting string theory news from them. And to be fair to string theory, in the late 80s and early 90s, it sure did seem that there was something in string theory that desperately needed to be investigated. It was not a whole, people like to sort of look at it with hindsight and say all these people, they went off the deep end and they're all crazy. That's really not true. There were a lot of aesthetic indications, if you like, that there could actually be something here that was of direct relevance to particle physics. Now, as they went deeper and deeper and deeper into string theory, it turned out that no, it isn't really directly relevant to our world. But nevertheless, it still remains extremely interesting mathematics. And it also remains extremely interesting mathematical physics, if you like, because it spun off a whole host of new techniques that you can use. ADS CFT is the most famous one in other parts of physics to solve problems that nobody knew how to solve before. So it's been very fruitful. So, you can sort of criticize it for being a little bit grandiose, which they were, but they were excited.
Can you just define quickly string theory for people listening that might not be familiar with it?
So the statement is that there are no that all of nature is made up of strings, tiny little strings, in and those strings, depending on how they vibrate in different ways, make up different particles. So different vibrations of the strings make up a different kind of particle. So it's actually, in a sense, really very contiguous with quantum field theory, because in quantum field theory, as I said before, different excitation levels of the field define different kinds of particles. In quantum field theory, you're attaching numbers to each point in space-time. So really, you're talking about point stuff. In string theory, if you wish, you can think of it as slightly extended stuff. And it's the vibrations of that slightly extended stuff that tells you something about particles. It's very philosophically contiguous with quantum field theory. And what ends up happening is, however, that strings are so rich in terms of their phenomena. There's so many different things that they can do that it's actually it's too big. It's not something that you can use to explain the world, because it explains everything, and therefore it explains nothing. It doesn't restrict you in any way, which it needs to.
Okay, that makes sense. Tracking. Okay, so you started playing with chaos theory. Or can you also define chaos theory before we get into the rest of the finance
Yes.
stuff?
So chaos theory, I referred to also obliquely at the beginning of our talk, is the statement that things are very sensitive to the initial conditions. So that is to say, you write down a mathematical equation for your system. When you put its inputs in, those inputs are real numbers. And chaos theory is the study of those systems where the result of the mathematical equation is incredibly sensitive to the nth digit of those real numbers that come in.
Okay, so you start applying these things to what, the market conditions
Yeah,
or the
S&P
values?
500 actually,
Okay, so
the broadmost stock market.
but what are the variables that you're using with it? Is it because there's condition? Is it strictly numbers, or are you taking into account world events and politics? Like, for example, prior to COVID, nobody was going to invest in Zoom, but then a world thing happens and Zoom goes through the roof because everyone's meeting virtually. What sorts of variables are you applying to this?
That's a good question. So initially, and now I can talk about it because it doesn't work anymore. But initially, for the first 10 years or so, there were significant inefficiencies, if you like, in the stock market. In the 90s, there were lots of inefficiencies because there were not very many people using mathematics to trade. So you didn't even need, as you just pointed out, a multivariate model. A univariate model would be sufficient. That is to say, you only needed one variable.
Okay.
And so the one variable here was, in fact, the prices of the S&P 500 itself. And the hypothesis was that if you could find patterns of behavior in the S&P 500 in the past, you could use chaos theory to make the hypothesis that those patterns would repeat again in the future. And in fact, they seem to for quite a long time. So that worked for quite some time. And so that was really my first exposure to this, was realizing that you could use pattern recognition. This is before AI, of course, to make short-term predictions in the stock market and then trade those predictions. And so that's what I was doing for the first 10 years of my trading life.
Are you going to somebody on Wall Street and being like, "Hey, I figured this thing out," or did you spend time playing around with it yourself, trying to disprove it, like you mentioned before? How did you end up with a career in it instead of just in your free time messing around with it?
So I told a very, very, very good friend of mine that I had in fact figured this out, and he was on Wall Street. And he said to me, dude, you really need to build a business around this. And I said, okay, but I don't know anybody. And he said, I'll make some introductions for you. And he did. And so that's how I got my first clients. And then, I built a business around that.
Okay. And then from the building the business perspective, once it works the first couple of times, I imagine it's not super difficult to get clients. You just say, "Hey, look at what we did," and then people are like, "Oh, I would also like to make money, so I'm going to hire you."
It's
Or not
harder
so
than you
much.
think.
Yeah, okay, go into that. Go into building the business from the standpoint of like you're in academia world to now you're going into entrepreneurship world, and these are not quite the same. So talk about the adjustment to that and how to gain clients and like navigating the whole
Yes.
Wall Street type
Yes.
scenario. Yeah.
So the first problem is that particularly back then, there was no such thing as a quant. Nowadays, there are a dime a dozen. They didn't exist. So nobody had any idea what it was to be a physicist using physics to make trades in the stock market. So they would all look at it like it was voodoo and say, well, we don't really believe this, even though, yeah, you can show a track record and yeah, you're profitable and you've done very well and whatever, but we don't believe this. We don't understand it. So then you had to try to explain it to them in terms that they understood. But there really was no good crossover between their language and any language that I could use to express what I was actually doing. So it was difficult to find clients. That's the first problem.
Mm.
The second problem is that when you talk to business people, particularly finance people, they expect you to be a certain way. That's no longer true because there's physicists all over Wall Street, but it was true back then. So one of the things that you run into is that they all thought that physics was boring. So they assumed that you were a boring person too. And they would say this to you openly. It's not like they even hate it. Um, so it became very difficult to really communicate. And the third problem was that I very, very, very rapidly realized that I was used to the academic method of discourse, where by and large, yes, there are egos, yes, people have feelings and all this other stuff. But by and large, people will passionately argue because really they're just simply trying to find out what's true and what's not. And people are not particularly concerned about whose ox is being gored or whether this guy is higher up in the hierarchy or whether he has a Nobel Prize or whatever the heck. No one cares, really. You're just arguing about trying to figure out what's true because nobody goes into academia to get rich, right? Um, so I very rapidly realized that this is not true in the corporate world, where there is a hierarchy and you can't argue with people and you can't tell them they're wrong and all this other stuff. And that made me tongue tied because I didn't know what I could say.
Mm.
And so I would actually sit down with my wife and say, make me a flow chart. I wonder if I still have it up on my wall somewhere. I don't know where it went. I kept my first flow chart where I needed to talk to an investor. And before I spoke to the investor, I sat down with her and I said, let's go through all the things the person might say. And then let's draw a flow chart of what I might say to what this person might say, and so on. So, it got absurd to the point where I was talking to some investors, or let's say a very famous investment banker, I won't name them. And I went to a meeting and I figured we were just going to chat about whether they were interested in our product and whether there would be a partnership to be had. So I sat down in the first available chair, right? So the guy walks in and looks at me and says, you're sitting at the head of the table? Dude, I'm just sitting in a chair. It's that kind of thing that for somebody like me with my mentality was very difficult to deal with. Now, over the years, I've learned to deal with it. But then circling back to something you asked me in the past, I actually, now that I learned to deal with it, I no longer care. So if they want to get offended, too bad. I just don't
Mm.
care anymore. I disrespect all hierarchies at this point, just as a matter of principle.
But I don't disagree with that either, to be honest. That's fair enough. So, okay, so you're building the business, and at what point there was, I imagine there wasn't really like a I'm good at this moment because the math kind of spoke for itself. Um, but where like did you have a situation or maybe a thought or a moment with your wife or your family where you're like, okay, I am this will be sustainable from the standpoint of like this is not just a fad, and even if this theory doesn't start to work out, like you mentioned, it doesn't work anymore, but now we're like settled enough in that we can go forth and this will be our thing? Like how was that sort of moment, or did it just happen gradually over time, or was there at one point you're like, okay, we're good and this is what we'll be doing?
Both. That superb question. Both. So one of the things about me, my personality, is that people say that I'm very confident, but it's not confidence. It's effectively just preparation.
Mm.
And so one of the things that I did do, which a lot of physicists didn't do when they went to Wall Street, is I actually read tons and tons and tons of economics and finance papers and books. I calculated the other day that I was reading about 10 to 12 papers a day for the first 3 or 4 years, just so that I understood the language and what was going on, and books and so on and so forth. So as I started to understand it and I understood the language, I also started to understand what works and what doesn't work and what might work. And then the other thing I realized, which is a self realization, is that when things go wrong, which they always do when you're investing, that's basically life consists of things going wrong. I have the personality that I don't panic. It just happens that I don't. I mean, it's just that's me. And because I don't panic, it means I can still think rationally when things are going wrong. And I don't really have a problem pulling the plug on a crappy trade and saying, hey, this didn't work, and just moving on and saying, I lost money. It's too bad. Nothing I can do about it. And it turns out, from having read a lot of trading books, that taking a loss is sort of the hardest lesson for many traders to learn. For me, for whatever reason, that was not genuinely a problem. I can take a loss. Of course, I'm very unhappy and I'm sad and I don't sleep very well and it pisses me off and so on. But I can actually do it. It doesn't, in that sense, stop me from doing the right thing. I don't hesitate and say, oh no, maybe it'll come back. So I learned that too. And so then I learned that if that's the case, I might actually be fairly decent at this particular trading game. And so that's both a gradual realization and also a very specific realization saying, yeah, I think I should do this, because I actually was offered a teaching position a couple of years in to my thinking about doing this business.
Mm-hmm.
And I told the gentleman who's very kind to offer me the position. I said, can I think about it? And he was a bit surprised. He says, oh. I said, I promise I'll get back to you tomorrow. So I called him back the following day and I said, look, I really decided to do this. And he said, believe it or not, a few of my students are thinking of doing this too. So I wish you luck. But yeah, I mean, I really did think about it. I could have actually taken the academic position, moved on that way. But it was by then clear to me that I was actually decent at it. So I might as well just do it. And then again, the funding problem was never going to be solved.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Okay, so coming kind of full circle, you're in Wall Street finance world. Where is the spark for the book? Like, where is it one idea? I think we talked about this a little bit on the phone, but um, I would like to know more because it's like digging back into the roots of what you're doing, but also in a kind of strange way, it ties into all the markets because they're predictable, but at the same time, they kind of have a mind of their own, to use the term that we talked about before. So, like, where did
Yep.
that spark come from?
So I had thought of this distinction between free will in theory and free will in practice, although I hadn't called it that. That's a name I came up with for the book so that I could package the concept. But I thought of the solution a little bit before that. And, in fact, I texted my squash partner one day out of the blue and I said, dude, I know how to explain free will. And I typed it, in a paragraph. Here's the distinction. And he's used to getting weird texts like that from me. And I let it go at that point. And then, there's Tyler Cowen, who runs this podcast, Marginal Revolution, and is just an absolutely fantastic guy, has become a friend over the years, and we correspond a lot. And he was interviewing a very, very good physicist called David Deutsch. And David Deutsch said something that triggered in my head that, physics can explain what free will is, but physicists, by and large, don't bother to do it. Because in some sense, to most physicists, yeah, that's how it is. So I just, as a casual sort of email, sent Tyler an email, and I said, look, great conversation with David Deutsch. By the way, he said X. Actually, this means A, B, C, D, E, F, and it explains free will. And Tyler sent me back an email saying, hey, you got to write this up. And I sent him back an email saying, who cares about some random guy, sitting in Connecticut? Who cares what my opinion is? I'm a nobody. But he's a very persuasive guy. He's a very smart guy. And when a very smart guy is trying to be very persuasive and telling you to do something, you should do it. That's sort of my principle. So I said, okay, I'll write the book. And then another friend of mine, who's a very, very, very good surgeon, said to me, okay, if you write the book, I'll be your first editor. I'll help you clean up, infelicitous words and so on and so forth. And that was very kind of him. And I said, okay, now two very smart guys are telling me I got to write this book. So then I really do got to write this book. And then I started writing it, but it was going very slowly because I've had migraines my whole life. And they were really getting pretty bad. And then I met an amazing neurologist that told me about this new class of drugs called CGRP inhibitors. And if you have migraines, then CGRP inhibitors, without any significant side effects, just stop the process that causes the migraine to happen. And it was just like, for me, it was like a light switch, a miracle. It just turned off the migraines. And that meant I had all these extra hours now where I used to just lie in bed because my head hurt. And so I said, okay, now I have no excuse. I gotta write the book. So I did.
Was it difficult to kind of write a book in this nature versus the academic style papers that you had written before? Or at the end of the day, is writing just writing and you're writing about stuff that you know a lot about and it could just kind of flowed for you? Like what was the process like for sorting out the like how you wanted to package the arguments and the different things like just like scrolling through the table of contents, like it makes sense how you did it, but there it also looks like at first glance to me anyways, like there would have been multiple ways to package it and it would have still made sense. So like was that a difficult process for you or did it just kind of flow in this way? And how did the whole process work? And then obviously you found Ben the publishing people and they helped you out, I'm sure. But how was that process for you as a first time kind of author of a book rather
Of
than
a
a
book.
paper?
It more or less flowed, but the reason it more or less flowed is that I had an overall structure in mind. And the reason I had an overall structure in mind is that I really believe something that Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, used to say all the time, tongue in cheek, of course, which is that until you can explain it to your bartender, you don't understand it. And as a general principle, I think that's a very good one.
Yeah.
And so before I say I think I know something, I always imagine that I'm explaining it to somebody that is not an expert in a field, but is interested and is bright and curious. And so I should be able to explain, at least at a decent level, what it is that I think I've figured out to that person. And so I have this conversation with myself in my head all the time. I explain things to me all the time. And I'm always trying to refine things so that, when the explanation comes out, it actually makes sense. And so I essentially decided that the book would be a conversation with myself. So you'll notice that I tried to make it unstuffy
Yeah.
and not terribly formal because I'm actually writing it out to explain it to myself, if you like, in the clearest way that I know how.
It comes off that way. It comes off like an explanation to whether it's to you or just to the reader. I mean, to me anyways, that's how it comes off. So,
So that was the idea. And then, so there was a overall structure. I wrote the main portion of it, that's the beginning of it. And then I wrote the end of it. And then afterwards, I started to fill in the stuff in the middle because I sort of knew what I wanted there. And so I put in a skeleton. And then, whenever I took my dog out for a walk, I'd say, okay, I have this piece of the skeleton. How can I say something interesting or useful or, just funny that people might like to read about that is relevant to this particular piece? And so then I started to fill in the different sections that way. What I didn't do is sort of what they tell first-time authors to do, which is to write, an outline and then stick to the outline and so on. That's just not how I do things, and I figured that I'm just going to do it my way. And if it
yeah.
comes out good, it comes out good.
Well, also your subject material is slightly different than a normal story with a beginning, middle, and
I
end.
guess that's true.
Not that yours doesn't have that, but it's slightly different in what you're explaining. Um, I think again, just for people listening, the title of the book is The Science of Free Will: How Determinism Affects Everything from the Future of AI to Traffic to God to Bees. Um, is there any other last kind of like tidbits or nickels that you want to talk about that we haven't touched on? I feel like we could probably do another hour and a half on each subject that we touched on. But is there anything else that you want to touch on before we get you out of here?
So the only thing that I would like to touch on is that at some point I would like to have a discussion with a theologian that is familiar with science, because from the point of view of physics, the trouble is that if you theologically believe in a higher being that is not disinterested in humans, that is to say, he didn't just set the world in motion and move on, but actually actively intervenes in human affairs, I think you've got a major conflict with the laws of physics. And even if you say, okay, well, I don't, I can sort of get around the major conflict with the laws of physics, I think you run into an even more major problem with the concept of free will altogether.
Mm,
Because, and I go through this in the book, if you say that there is a being that actually intervenes in human affairs, that is to say, if this being wished, it could remove all the air from on top of the Sahara today and then put it back tomorrow, i.e., violate the laws of physics, then you run into a problem, in my opinion, and I think I'm right, that you can't have free will either in practice or in theory. Because then what you're saying is the laws of physics actually do not exist. And the reason you're saying the laws of physics do not exist, and by the way, it's the laws of physics that give you a free will in practice, is that the laws of physics are supposed to be true always and at all times. And if the laws of physics are not true always and at all times, then they aren't laws of physics. And if they're not laws of physics, it means you can't appeal to the laws of physics to talk about free will in practice. And
mm.
because there are no more laws of physics, you can't have free will in theory either, because whatever events are taking place are being controlled by another being somewhere else. So then it seems to me you run into a serious theological problem. But I'm not a theologian, so I'd love to know what their solution to this issue is, because I don't see one.
I think I might know a guy. That we can make that we can make that happen. I'd be super interested to host that for sure.
All right, hey, let's do it.
Yeah, let me reach out to a few people. I think we can make that happen for sure. I think the first thing that you the first thing, so I'll give you a little bit of prep on what the first kind of principle, or not, it's not first principles from the standpoint of, you know what I mean. The first kind of thing that they might say in response is, well, if a being that created everything, including the laws of physics, wouldn't that being be able to violate his own rules because he made them?
Yes,
So,
but then the rules don't exist. That's the problem.
well, that's for you to discuss with the theologian. I don't know enough theology or physics to get into the middle of that, but I would be very happy to host. Let me do some thinking, and there might be a few people that we could get on
Fabulous.
board to do that.
Love to have that conversation.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, this was a great conversation. First of all, I appreciate your time. The book, I need to finish the book, of course, but from what I've read, it's, I love how it's laid out. The conversational kind of format of it makes total sense to me.
Thank you.
It's not too difficult to digest, like from what you said. If you can explain it to somebody that's curious but not an expert in the fields, like I feel like I'm understanding. Um, and I took, I don't know, one physics class in college, maybe. So, um, but no, it's very where is it? It's on Amazon and all the normal
It's on
places that people
Amazon,
would
all
buy
the normal
books.
bookstores. Yep, it's a standard publication. It's
Okay.
out, I think the 25th of February in the UK and the 1st of March in the US.
Okay, sounds good. So people stay on the lookout for that. This I will see if I can. I'm not sure exactly when will be released. We'll talk after, see if I can like finagle some scheduling things to get the release closer to the release date of the book. Um, any last nickels before we get you out of here?
No, sounds good to me. Eric, thank you so much for this conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thoroughly. So this was really cool.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And for you guys listening, check the links out. Put a reminder on your calendar to get the book. I actually really recommend just people just go read it because it's a unique touch on a thing that affects us on a daily basis. So, highly recommend. And thank you guys for listening, and we will see you guys next time. Peace. Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you want to watch another episode like this one, click there. If you want to subscribe, click there.